Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are and whenever you are. Welcome to Season 3, Episode 5 of The Devil and the Deep Blue Me, and I am your host, Rich Bruck. Today we're talking about something that's taken me decades to fully embrace. Owning your weird. And I mean really owning it. Your quirks, your oddities, your off-center way of seeing the world. And why it's not just helpful, but essential for living authentically and creating anything worth sharing with anyone. I'll be honest with you. I've always been a little offbeat. My sense of humor tends toward the dry and maybe even slightly dark, and my thought patterns, well, let's just say, I make connections that don't always make sense to other people. And for most of my life, I tried very hard to hide these quirks, especially around people I wanted to impress or to fit in with. But here's what I have learned. Weirdness has a way of showing up anyway. You can try to sand off your rough edges, try to present a more palatable version of yourself, but your essential strangeness is going to leak out eventually anyway. And when it does, it's often in moments that feel very awkward or embarrassing, because you haven't learned to own it yet. And what I've come to understand is that embracing what makes you unusual isn't just optional, it's essential. Not just for your creative work, though that's a huge part of it, but for your basic sense of integrity, your ability to connect authentically with other people, and your capacity to contribute something unique to the world. So today, we're going to explore why society works so hard to smooth out our weird edges and why that's ultimately counterproductive for everyone involved. And how learning to own your oddities can become one of your most powerful tools for both creative work and for authentic living. Because here's what I have discovered. The parts of yourself you're most tempted to hide are often the parts that contain your greatest gifts. And if you spend your whole life trying to be normal, you rob the world of whatever weird genius you are meant to contribute. And I have been thinking a lot about this lately. I've been thinking about the word weird and how loaded it is. When we're kids, being called weird is usually not a compliment. It means you're different in a way that makes other people uncomfortable. And that marks you as somehow outside the acceptable range of human behavior. I remember in school when I was young, maybe 8, 9, 10 years old, showing up to school wearing this band t-shirt that I had gotten from an older cousin. And they had turned me on to this band. And this kid, I can still see his face, looked at my shirt and said, "That's weird, man." Not mean-spirited, actually, just dismissive. Like anything outside his reference frame was automatically suspect. But I internalized that message. And for years after that, I was hyper-aware of seeming too different or too interested in things that other people didn't care about. I learned to read the room and to gauge what kind of music references were safe to make and what level of enthusiasm was acceptable for things that I cared about. But the more I think about it now, the more I realize that this smoothing out process happens to all of us in different ways. We learn to modulate our natural responses and to edit our instinctive reactions, to present versions of ourselves that we think will be more acceptable to whatever group we're trying to belong to. Take professional environments. I've been in many meetings and stuff where you can feel everyone performing this acceptable level of engagement. Not too excited, not too critical, not too anything that might mark them outside the professional norm. And meanwhile, the most interesting ideas and, the ones that might actually solve some problems or create something new, those ideas are sitting unspoken because they feel too risky or too weird to voice. And in creative context, this is even more tragic because creativity, by definition, is about bringing something into existence that wasn't there before. And that almost always requires you to venture into territory that feels strange or unusual or potentially embarrassing. I remember working on this song arrangement a few years ago that had this really unusual time signature change in the bridge, and it felt completely natural to me when I was playing it alone, but every time I thought about performing it for other people, I would always second guess myself. Is this too weird? Will people be able to follow this? Should I just simplify it to something more conventional? And you know what happens when you start second guessing your instincts like that? The life disappears out of the work. You end up with something that's technically competent, but completely forgettable. Something that doesn't offend anyone, but also doesn't really move anyone either. But here's what I've started to understand. Authenticity and weirdness aren't separate things. Your weirdness, the specific idiosyncratic way that you see and respond to the world, that's not something you have in addition to your authentic self. That is your authentic self. At least, a very big part of it. And owning that requires tremendous courage because it means you're going to make some people uncomfortable. Some people won't get your references. Some people won't find your sense of humor very funny. Some people will look at your creative work and think, that's different. In a tone, of course, that makes it very clear that they don't mean it as a compliment. But the alternative, spending your whole life trying to be a palatable version of yourself, well, that's no way to live. And it's certainly no way to create anything that matters. So somewhere along the way, I started to flip the script. Instead of seeing my weird interests and unusual perspectives as problems to manage, I started seeing them as resources to draw from. Instead of trying to hide the parts of myself that don't fit conventional molds, I started getting curious about what those parts might have to contribute. And let me be clear, this isn't something I figured out once and now I'm done with it. Owning your weird is an ongoing practice, especially in a world that's constantly giving you signals to tone it down or fit in or be more like everybody else. But it's also one of the most liberating things you can ever do, both for your creative work and for your basic sense of integrity as a human being. So then let's start with the obvious question. Why does society work so hard to discourage weirdness in the first place? Because it's not accidental. From childhood through to adulthood, we get constant signals to conform, to smooth out our rough edges, and to present more standardized versions of ourselves. Think about how school works. You sit in rows, you raise your hands to speak, you learn the same curriculum at the same pace as everyone else. And kids who learn differently, who think differently, who express themselves differently, they often get labeled as problems to be solved rather than individuals with unique ways of processing the world. I remember this teacher I had in school, in public school, who used to say, there are no stupid questions, but there are weird ones. And she'd say it with this little laugh, like it was supposed to be encouraging. But what I heard was, don't ask the questions that reveal how differently your mind works from everybody else's. And this continues into adulthood, in workplaces, social groups, even creative communities. Everywhere you go, there's this subtle pressure to operate within acceptable parameters, to not rock the boat too much, to be just different enough to be interesting, but not so different that you make people uncomfortable. And, sure, part of this makes sense from an organizational perspective. If everyone's operating from the same playbook, if everyone's using similar frameworks and languages, things run more smoothly. Meetings are more efficient, projects move faster, decisions get made without having to account for too many variations. But what we lose in that efficiency is enormous. We lose the perspectives that might reveal blind spots in our conventional approaches. We lose the ideas that might solve problems we didn't even know we had. And we lose the innovations that come from someone looking at a situation from a completely different angle. And in creative context, this pressure to conform is absolutely deadly, because creativity requires you to venture into unknown territory, to try things that might not work, or to follow instincts that don't have any sort of logical explanations. There's also this basic human desire for predictability and social interactions. When everyone's operating within similar parameters, it's easier to know what to expect or how to respond or what's safe to say. Weird people disrupt that social comfort by being unpredictable, by responding in ways that don't fit the usual patterns. I've been in many conversations where I've made some connection between two seemingly unrelated topics, Like, I don't know, comparing the rhythm of a particular song to the way traffic flows through a certain intersection. And I can see people trying to figure out if I'm being serious or if I'm making some kind of a joke that they don't understand. And that discomfort isn't malicious, usually. It's just that most people have learned to navigate social situations by reading familiar cues and following familiar scripts. So when someone operates outside those scripts, it creates this moment of uncertainty that, many people find uncomfortable. So then over time, we learn to self-edit. We learn to gauge the room before we speak. We learn to consider whether our natural response is going to fit the context, or to present versions of ourselves that we think will be more digestible for whoever we're interacting with. And this self-editing becomes habitual. Eventually, you're not just hiding your weirdness in professional context or formal social situations, you're hiding it everywhere, even from yourself. You lose touch with your natural responses, your instinctive ways of seeing and thinking about things. And the tragic result is that we end up with a culture full of people who are performing acceptable versions of themselves rather than expressing their authentic perspectives. And then we wonder why so much of our art feels generic, and why so many of our solutions to problems feel recycled, and why so many of our conversations feel superficial and very predictable. But here's what I've learned from years of creative work, and also from observing people who create things that actually matter, in my opinion. What makes you weird is often exactly what makes your perspective valuable. Think about any significant innovation in art, science, business, social change. It almost always comes from someone who was willing to think differently, to approach problems from unusual angles, and to ignore conventional wisdom about how things are supposed to work. In music, the artists we remember are rarely the ones who perfectly execute the, hit song formula. They're the ones who brought something strange and new to the mix. So I think about my own creative breakthroughs, and they almost always come from when I stop trying to write what I think I should write and start following some sort of weird instinct about rhythm or melody, or especially lyrical approach that doesn't have any sort of logical explanation. Like, I wrote this song called Tuesday Morning, which is kind of a weird title, I guess, already. But I had this specific feeling about the particular kind of melancholy that hits you on a Tuesday morning when you realize the week is going to be longer than you thought. And I followed that specific weird emotional territory instead of trying to write a more generic song about sadness. And that specific weirdness is what made the song interesting to other people. Because while not everyone, has Tuesday morning blues specifically, most people have experienced that feeling of unexpected melancholy tied to particular times or situations. The weird actually made it more universally relatable, not less. And, this applies to problem solving in general, not just creative work. When someone's thinking about a problem the same way, using the same frameworks, making the same assumptions, you tend to get the same kind of solutions. But when someone approaches the problem from a completely different angle, when their weird way of thinking reveals aspects of the situation that others hadn't even considered, well, then that's where the breakthroughs suddenly emerge. I had a student once who was struggling with a particular guitar technique that most people learn through repetitive practice. And she had this really kind of cool approach where she would visualize the finger movements as dance steps and create these elaborate mental choreographed moves for her hands. And her other teacher initially discouraged this as overthinking, but it was actually the key to how her particular mind processed complex motor skills. And what I've noticed is that people who are willing to own their weird ways of thinking often become excellent at pattern recognition in their fields, because they're not limited to seeing things the way that they're supposed to be seen. They notice connections that others miss. And they ask questions that others don't even think to ask. And they certainly experiment with approaches that others dismiss as, being impractical. In creative work specifically, your weirdness is often what gives you an authentic voice, because Anyone can learn technique, and anyone can master the conventional approaches, and anyone can create competent work that hits all of the expected marks. But your particular combination of interests and obsessions and ways of seeing the world, well, that is something that nobody else has. And here's something that might seem counterintuitive. Audiences often connect more deeply with the weird, specific work than with generic, broadly appealing work, because when you're being authentic and strange in your own way, when you're following your actual instincts rather than trying to please everyone, you create work that feels alive and present and even surprising. But this obviously requires the courage to be disliked by some people. Not everyone's going to connect with your particular brand of weirdness. And some people are going to find your creative work too strange or too specific or too outside their comfort zone. And that's not only okay, it's necessary. Because when you're willing to be weird, when you're not trying to appeal to everyone, you naturally filter for the people who do connect with your particular way of seeing things. You find your actual audience, the people who need exactly what you're offering, rather than trying to water down your vision to appeal to the broadest possible demographic. So then how do you actually go about owning your weird? Because it's one thing to intellectually understand that your oddities might be assets, and it's, another thing to actually live that way, especially when you've spent years learning to hide the parts of yourself that don't fit conventional molds. My approach has always been to just start small. Don't try to revolutionize your entire personality overnight. Instead, look for small opportunities to share something authentic that feels slightly risky, slightly outside your normal public persona. Maybe it's mentioning a book that you love that nobody else has heard of, or maybe it's sharing an unusual observation about something mundane that most people wouldn't think twice about. Or maybe it's wearing something that feels slightly wrong for the context, but right for who you are. For me, it started with being more honest about my musical influences in conversations. Instead of always referencing artists that I knew other people would recognize, I started talking about the obscure artists and experimental musicians who kind of shaped my taste. And sure, sometimes I got a lot of blank stares, but sometimes I got excited responses from people who either knew the artists or were curious to discover something new. And then here's what I've discovered. Every small act of authenticity builds confidence for the next one. So when you share something weird about yourself and the world doesn't end, and when people either connect with it or just move on without making it into a big deal, you realize that most of your fears about being too different were extremely overblown. In creative work, start with private experiments. Try that unusual chord progression, right from that strange perspective. Explore that subject matter that feels too specific or too personal. Don't worry about whether it's good or whether anyone else will understand it. Just see what happens when you follow your actual instincts instead of your ideas about what you should be creating. Personally, I started keeping what I call a weird file, a weird ideas file, just a document where I write down thoughts, connections, creative impulses that feel too strange or specific to share immediately. And periodically, I'll go back through it and realize that some of those weird ideas have developed into actually some of my most interesting work. In social situations, practice what I think of as authentic engagement rather than acceptable engagement. Instead of always saying what you think people want to hear, try occasionally saying what you actually think, what you're actually curious about, or what you actually find funny or interesting. Now, of course, I'm not advocating for being inappropriate or disrespectful. There's a difference between being authentically weird and being deliberately provocative or insensitive. The goal isn't to shock people or to make them uncomfortable just for its own sake, but it's to express your genuine perspective instead of constantly performing a sanitized version of yourself. And pay attention to what happens when you own your weirdness. Often you'll discover that the things you thought were your most embarrassing quirks are actually what make you the most interesting to other people. The specific obsessions, the unusual connections you make, or the off-center humor, those are often what people remember about you and what makes conversations with you different from conversations with anybody else. Even in professional contexts, there are usually ways to integrate more of your authentic perspective. Maybe it's approaching problems from your particular angle, or maybe it's bringing your specific kind of creativity to projects. Maybe it's being the person who asks the questions that nobody else thinks to ask. Start with low-stakes situations and gradually expand to contexts that feel more risky. And as you build confidence in your ability to be authentically weird without the world ending, you'll find yourself naturally bringing more of your genuine perspective to all areas of your life. The ultimate goal isn't to become more weird, it's to become more integrated, more whole. To stop splitting yourself into different versions for different contexts and instead develop the confidence to show up as one person everywhere you go. And of course, remember, this is a practice, not a destination. I still catch myself editing my natural responses sometimes, and I still find myself performing acceptable versions of myself in certain contexts, but I've gotten better at noticing when I'm doing it, and I'm better at making small corrections back toward being authentic. Weirdness doesn't repel people. Genericness does. When you're trying so hard to be relatable that you sand off all your rough edges, you end up creating something that's technically inoffensive but ultimately forgettable. But when you get specific, when you dig into the particular way you experience universal human situations, you often end up creating something that's more universally relatable, not less. So here's what I want you to take away from all of this talking about embracing your oddities and owning what makes you different. First of all, your weird is your brand. Not in a commercial sense necessarily, but in the sense that your particular combination of interests, perspectives, and ways of seeing the world is what makes you distinctively you. When you try to hide that or smooth it over, you completely rob yourself and everyone else of your unique contribution. And weirdness and authenticity aren't separate things. Your oddities, your specific way of processing the world, your unusual interests and perspective, that's not something you have in addition to your authentic self. That is your authentic self, or at least, a crucial part of it. And in creative work, especially, your weird perspective is often your most valuable asset, because anyone can learn technique, anyone can master conventional approaches, but your particular way of seeing things and your specific obsessions and curiosities, that's what gives you an authentic voice that can't be replicated. And the more specifically and authentically weird you're willing to be, the more likely you are to create genuine connections with other people. Because when you're trying to appeal to everyone, you end up appealing to no one. But when you're unapologetically yourself, you naturally attract the people who resonate with your particular way of being in the world. Owning your weird is a practice, not a one-time decision. So start small with low-stake opportunities to share something authentic that feels just a little risky, and build your confidence through small experiments before you try to revolutionize your entire public persona. Nobody else is going to give you permission to be fully yourself. Society will always have reasons why you should tone it down, fit in better, be more like everyone else, but the world doesn't need more people trying to be like everyone else. It needs more people brave enough to be specifically, authentically themselves. So lean into your oddities, share your unusual perspectives, follow your weird creative instincts, and ask your strange questions. Make your specific observations about the world, not because it's easy, it's often not, but because the only way to make your genuine contribution to whatever field or community or relationship that you're part of. Your weird isn't a bug in your programming that needs to be fixed. It's a feature that makes you interesting, makes you valuable, and makes you necessary. The question isn't whether you should own it. The question is whether you're brave enough to let other people see it. And now it's time for this week's EnRICHment segment, where we explore some fascinating facts that might change how you think about the value of being different. Did you know that octopuses have been observed engaging in what scientists call play behavior? They've been seen juggling rocks, shooting water jets at objects just for fun, and creating elaborate dens decorated with shells and debris in arrangements that serve no survival purpose. They're just aesthetically pleasing to the octopus. And what strikes me about this is that even in nature, there's room for individual expression that goes beyond pure function. These octopuses aren't just surviving, they're creating and playing and expressing something that's uniquely their own. Maybe the urge to be weird or to do things just because they feel right rather than because they serve an obvious purpose is more fundamental than we actually think. And here's another one. Research on innovation in organizations shows that most breakthrough ideas typically come from what they call boundary spanners, people who work at the intersections of different fields, who have unusual combinations of expertise, and who think in ways that don't fit neatly into established categories. And that certainly resonates with me because it suggests that people who feel like they don't quite fit anywhere might actually be exactly where the most interesting discoveries happen. Your weird combination of interests and your unusual way of connecting ideas from different domains, that might not be a liability. That might be actually a superpower. And then finally, studies of creative individuals across different fields consistently show that most innovative work comes from people who are willing to risk failure, who are comfortable with ambiguity, and who maintain what psychologists call cognitive flexibility, which is the ability to switch between different ways of thinking about a problem. So in other words, the qualities that make you seem weird to other people, your willingness to consider unusual possibilities or your comfort with uncertainty, your tendency to approach problems from unexpected angles, these are exactly the qualities that lead to genuine innovation and creative breakthroughs. So there you have it. It seems the world needs people who are willing to be different, to think differently, to express their unique perspectives. And your weird isn't holding you back. It's what the world has been waiting for. And just for a quick music update, and it ties directly in today's theme, naturally. I've been working on this piece that started with what I can only describe as a wrong chord progression. I was trying to play a standard type progression, something that would fit comfortably in the singer-songwriter sort of tradition, but my fingers kept wanting to go to these weird voicings that technically shouldn't work together. And naturally, at first, I kept correcting myself, trying to force my hands back to the right chords, but then I remembered what I had been talking about trusting your instincts even when they lead you somewhere unexpected. So I decided to follow the weird progression and see where it wanted to go. And what emerged was this piece that was elements of all different kinds of things that, I don't know, it shouldn't work theoretically, but when I play it, it just feels completely natural. Like it's expressing something that I couldn't say with conventional chord structures. Anyway, I'm going to call it Beautiful Mistakes, which might be too much on the nose, but sometimes the song tells you what it wants to be called, and that title captures something important about the creative process. Sometimes what feels like a mistake or what seems wrong according to conventional rules is actually the thing that makes your work distinctive. And this connects to everything we've been discussing about owning your weird in music and in life. The impulse to correct yourself, to conform, to establish patterns and do the things the right way, that impulse can prevent you from discovering what your particular creative voice has to offer. If you'd like to follow with any of my musical experiments or any of the songs that I have completed, there are links to all of your favorite streaming platforms here on YouTube. And if you are listening on YouTube already, please hit subscribe and support some indie talent. And you'll get a behind-the-scenes glimpses. And, of course, you get this podcast and you'll get to see the finished stuff as it comes out as well. The beautiful thing about music is that it rewards authenticity over technical perfection. The songs that move people aren't usually the ones that follow all the rules. They're the ones that express something genuine, even when that expression comes through unusual or unexpected means. Anyway, that's it for episode 5, a deep dive into why your weirdness is actually your superpower and why learning to own it is essential for both creative work and authentic living. And here's what I would like to hear from you. What's one weird thing about yourself that you've been hiding or downplaying? Maybe it's an unusual interest or a strange way of thinking about familiar problems or a creative impulse that doesn't fit obvious categories. Send me a message, leave me a comment, let me know all about it because I love collecting these stories and I love hearing other people's weird little quirks and the things that make them special. Because I think we need more examples of people owning their weird successfully. More evidence that authenticity and strangeness can be assets rather than liabilities. We need more weird music, weird art, weird solutions to problems, and weird perspectives on very familiar situations. So, if you're feeling too different, too strange, too outside whatever norm you think you're supposed to fit into, remember that the world doesn't need more people trying to be like everyone else. It needs more people brave enough to be specifically, authentically themselves. Your weird perspective isn't a personal quirk that you need to manage or hide. It's a contribution that you're meant to make, a gift you're meant to give, and a way of seeing the world that nobody else beside you can provide. The parts of yourself you're most tempted to hide are often the parts that contain your greatest gifts. So stop hiding, start owning. Let your freak flag fly, as they used to say, because the world needs exactly the kind of weird that you have to offer. Normal is far overrated as it is. And while you are practicing being or getting comfortable in your beautifully, authentically strange, please have yourself a safe and happy week.